Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Roots, and next to me here is David Wood, and we're having a conversation about When the Church Stops Working, a book of mine that is written for lay people and for discussions around some of the themes of Ministry in a Secular Age series. And so we're going to start with chapter one and talk for a while. So, David, what's up?
Not much. Good to see you and assume everybody that is watching. Great to have everybody on board with us. Andy, thanks for this book.
Yeah,
Um, you and I talked a long time ago about the need for this kind of a book that starts to translate what can feel to many people like pretty complicated things and realities, to do so in a way that people can hopefully take it into their churches, right? I mean, that's sort of the primary purpose of this book.
yeah, absolutely. It's kind of written, like I said, for lay leaders and others. The Ministry in the Secular Age series, that 3 volumes that turned into 6 volumes. Uh, there's a lot of footnotes in there. There's a lot
Yeah.
of direct conversations with philosophers and theologians, and so the idea is to kind of streamline this book and pick up where a lot of folks who are watching this had asked me, kind of like, all right, this is great, but how do I help my council or my session discuss this, or our new vision team? And so that's the idea behind this, is that some of those themes will come out and we can have a conversation. But we also assume there's still more to talk about
Right.
as you read that. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with David, is because David not only knows these ideas so deeply, but has lived them out as, yeah, you just retired after how many years of pastoral ministry?
Gosh, like I guess 40 years.
Yeah.
Hard to believe, but yeah, about 40 years, and churches in everywhere from Kansas to Kentucky to New England to Paris, France. So here we are. And I think part of what got us into this project was a common sense that we had that people are feeling like something has changed or is changing dramatically, and within a short period of time, this change is happening. And I could see over the course of my ministry, and trends that were accelerating in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years, especially. And like, for instance, one of those trends I felt keenly, especially in the last several years, is that just people's availability to church life seemed to drop off dramatically. And these are people who felt genuinely excited about church life, but just their availability to church life, whether it was volunteering in the Sunday school or coffee hour or attending a midweek adult education class, all of those things just began to drop off dramatically. And it didn't seem to connect to the quality of what was being done. It was just the nature of what something was changing in the way people were living their lives. And I think it was in reading Charles Taylor about living in a secular age that really began to help me make connections to what was happening in my congregation and the culture at large. And then reading Hartmut Rosa, which we'll talk about both these people over time. And your work in particular started to sort of make all those connections. So I feel like this is a conversation that people connect to because it names their experience, and I hope that's what happens in this. And I think a hope for this conversation is it proves to be a companion to your book, your book and Blair's book. Not we won't be summarizing the content as much as we will be sort of discussing the implications of the content. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's important.
So why don't we start? I mean, your assumption in the book is that we are in a crisis, right? There's no argument there. Agreed?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And and I think that you have a different, I think, read on just exactly what that crisis is, or more specifically, what it means to respond to that crisis. But I want to spend a little time on just illustrating what I think we all feel like is a sign of the crisis or evidence of it. And I think we have a couple of graphs I want to throw up on the screen that I think I really relate to. And this first one I think you're putting up is it has 4 graphs illustrated there, and going from right to left, it's the United Church of Christ, then the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, United Methodist Church, and then the Episcopal Church. Those are the 4 graphs you're looking at. And most of these graphs, it's really hard to read, I know, because the print's really small, but I want you just to sort of see the, I want everybody to see the trends more than anything. And the dates run from around 1966 on the left, to the left axis, over to 2010. And the one graph there on the lower right is the Episcopal Church, and that one ran from 1925. So you can see that the downward trend, all these downward trends begin to take place in the 1960s. And the drama, I mean, it just dramatically illustrates that we're not imagining. It's not just a local, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's not just a local experience of the crisis, but it's truly something that's pervasive. When we're talking here mostly, of course, the Protestant main line. Maybe go to the next one, and this will illustrate, the second graph illustrates my own denomination, which is American Baptist Churches. That's the graph on top. And that run, you can see once again in 1982, you can't really see the date, but that where the downward trend begins with American Baptists is 1982, and that's when I was ordained. I don't make a connection there, of course, but I want to say it's my experience has been in the American Baptist churches is that a constant and consistent and I should say accelerating decline over the entire course of my ministry. And if this graph went beyond 2010, it would drop off even further. And of course, then the one below that is the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church, and you can see that graph speaks for itself. Again, I think it's just a dramatic reality that we are truly experiencing unprecedented, at least in terms of our lifetimes, but certainly the 20th century, unprecedented decline in participation and numbers. And of course, that leads to waning influence, as you mentioned in the book, and so forth. But what's interesting is it cuts across. So there's something ubiquitous about this. And there's one more graph, the third one, which is one about the percentage of 18 to 25-year-olds who engage in various religious activities, including attending church, but also praying and reading the Bible. And you can just see, again, this dramatic drop-off. My guess is that anybody watching this can relate to this in their own local situation. Or maybe they can see how their congregation is becoming an exception to this, but it is an exception. It's not the rule. So I know I want to throw it back to you in terms of, declining participation is an issue and a serious issue. And your book acknowledges that, but I guess you want to push us beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, you could totally see when you look at those graphs. I mean, probably people looking at them. First of all, you may be having a heart attack because you're just trying to squint to see this on
Right.
YouTube or whatever. But after that, I mean, your blood pressure can go up just really quickly looking at
Yeah.
that. I mean, and you start to ask really kind of existential questions, or at least very practical questions for you if you're a pastor or
Right.
you're a lay leader. Like, okay, how do we keep the doors open? How do we pay the bills if this is happening? And like you said, a lot of those graphs end at 2010. So there's just no doubt that has a gravitational pull, and this
Right.
does impact us. And anyone who's watching this is a leader enough in their congregation or their denomination to know that this is a huge issue. But it becomes, I think, such a black hole, if you will, kind of thinking of
Yeah.
this cosmologically, like it's sucking everything into it, that I think in the book we're worried that this becomes the only narrative that frames us. And like you had mentioned Charles Taylor, one of the I think phenomenal things about his work, and one of the reasons is, if I wish I could pull it off the shelf right now, right? I'd probably hurt myself if I tried to, but it's a thick book.
Hmm.
And one of the things he really wants to get at is the whole conversation about kind of religious participation, or particularly the idea that religious institutions are becoming more fragile, is no doubt true. And
Right.
even more so outside of America than in America. But these graphs you just show say that America, especially mainline Protestantism, is feeling this too. But his point is that's not really what it means to live in a secular age. It's not just the secularization theory that the more modern a society gets, the less it needs church participation, though that's happened. But there's a kind
Right.
of double whammy at play, is I guess what we want to point to. But these numbers are so dramatic, and they do make your heart beat at such a kind of anxious level and your blood pressure go up, that they all energy, all creativity, all even need to be part of, say, the church council or the session or to do lay leadership is all trying to fix this issue. And yet we think that this issue comes with a much larger issue that if we're not careful, we'll never have the attention to really give to this larger issue.
And and so coming back to that feeling you're talking about, the raising of blood pressure, need to fix this in a local situation, without always conceiving of what's the larger reality going on here, is that I think we know that among pastors, right, the most serious concern out there is burnout
Yeah.
among pastors, and maybe that's a sign that our tendency is to sort of hit the accelerator as a way to try to outrun this creeping sense of demise. But of course, your sense is, and what you explain in the book to some degree, is that is a recipe for burnout, right? It's just to try to go faster and faster in order to make up for what is taking place across the board. Say a bit about, you mentioned the secular age and what it means that we're living in a secular age and how we are inevitably impacted by this. We cannot not be. It's just
Yeah.
the air we breathe. Um, so how would name for us again, in shorthand form,
Yeah.
what is that? What are the primary ways that we are impacted by living in this secular age?
Yeah, I mean it is the red herring here, which I think you've done a really nice job, David, with those graphs saying that it's true. Like
Right,
the decline anxiety is there,
right.
and we should become Pollyanna-ish and be like, oh, it's not an issue, or too pietistic to really deal with that issue. But the bigger issue isn't just participation, though that's an issue. The bigger issue is imagination and how people's imaginations have changed. And I think what Charles Taylor's trying to get at, that we're trying to get in the shorthand, is what it really means to live in a secular age is not to decide you don't want to go to church anymore, or that religion is dumb, or that you've outgrown such childish fairy tale ideas of religion, though that is a small segment of the population who believes that, but that's a small segment. Most people just come to a kind of framework where a kind of imagination where they don't really necessarily think God is a vital part of it. There's
Mhm.
no kind of sense that they need to even have in their lives, or they don't even know how to get if they want it, a kind of sense of a God who moves within history, who speaks
Mhm.
and acts. That prayer is something more than just maybe a mindfulness exercise.
Mhm.
That there is a deep sense. Especially as it's related, or as it comes to us through the kind of classic Christian tradition, that this idea of a kind of transcendent reality that frames our life and gives moral shape to it, that all just starts to kind of dissipate, and that people aren't sure they really need to hold on to it, or worse, a lot of people don't even know what it would look like to believe that. I mean, and not
Mhm.
just believe it like I believe this. So when the sociologist calls me and says, "Do I believe in God?" I say yes. No, believe it in a sense that it really shapes your life. It shapes how you raise your kids. It shapes what you do with your money. It shapes what you do with your time. Like all of that is bigger, and so the participation reality is happening. I mean that we feel that decline. Like we feel the sense, like you started with, of people not showing up. But it's not just because we haven't sold them a good product. It's not because we haven't worked hard enough to make the church appealing enough. This whole
Mhm.
imagination has shifted, where people just the connecting the dots that I'm someone who should be part of a religious community, or my children need to be in a community where they take the sacraments, say, that just is harder for people to even make sense of or link up to. And so that becomes the problem, is that the decline issue does point to something, but it points to, if we're not careful, we just think like, okay, we just need to do better and we need to do more to get that graph to at least plateau even at its bottom
Right.
level. You know what I mean? We need some kind of triage to stop the hemorrhaging of numbers. But our point is it's bigger than that. And if we just make it the hemorrhaging of numbers, we actually play into the very logic of this imagination that at the end of the day, this is just about human optimization and kind of forms of self help or something.
But that being said, about the shifting, overall imagination of the time and the culture we're living in, and how people see themselves and how they see transcendence. We talk about that. Um, it does. It also seems to say, though, that the church. What does it mean for the church to respond to that reality? I mean,
Yeah.
if it's not about doubling down and doing more programs and expanding one's offerings, if you will, it does seem, though, that it still requires a kind of different comprehension, a different understanding of what is required of us. And let's say as pastors. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, that's the question I think I have is is it still feels like pastors, for instance, have to be paying attention to these dynamics that we're going to be talking about more in the later chapters here. So it does put a burden, if you will, don't you think, a demand on pastors that's probably in some sense unprecedented, or is it just retrieving something that we've lost? Or
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, my guess is that that you have a good answer to this, having lived deeply in it. I do think it puts a demand on us. It there is a way that pastoral ministry shapes imagination, and we have to focus on that. I think the very identity of the pastor has to kind of respond to this issue being more one of imagination than one just of programming or marketing. But I mean, you've written really nicely about this. Have dealt with this the last kind of decade of your 40-year career, kind of feeling this. I mean, how would you name that, David? In the sense of like what's the demand that you feel like is kind of thrust upon the pastor with this change of imagination?
I think sort of going back to what you were saying about the shifts in the larger culture, I think I came to realize that whenever people showed up for worship on a Sunday, that was something I needed to understand had a whole lot more significance to it than I used to think, because I could no longer take that for granted. And it wasn't just about what we were offering or not offering. It was like I always felt like, and I used to say this often to people, that when they were driving to church, they were probably not in any kind of a traffic jam, because they were sort of by themselves heading in the opposite direction than everybody else was going. And I think there's no one who doesn't drive to church, certainly not younger people, especially, who don't feel that they are cutting against the grain. So I think that awareness sort of caused me to sort of pay a different kind of attention to what we did in worship and how we functioned, and how we ordered worship, and to take it, I should say, take it more seriously from start to finish. And it doesn't mean I got more flashy. We didn't put a bunch of screens up in the sanctuary. We didn't do that. But it did mean that I learned to take that more seriously. And I did learn to also realize that people weren't looking for another version of the op-ed page.
Mm.
At the same time, they wanted to, I think, have some sense of how what was happening here related to the larger world. But what they didn't need was more political commentary, even though politics may enter into it from time to time. They didn't need to be proved once again that we're on the cutting edge of every social issue that's coming up, even though social issues are important. But there was something that needed to happen in worship that was uniquely about worship and about the experience of God and the experience of community and the sacraments. And so all of these things became more important to me, and more central to everything we were about. And that it was sort of became the center from which radiated out the energy that drew people into the life of the church. And all of them over time, over these years, would tell the stories about why they were in church. And they would inevitably talk about the experience of being in worship.
Yeah.
That's what sort of spoke to them. At the same time, they spoke about other things. But if that is not, in some sense, a vital center, and that, coming back to what I just said, is not about flashing screens and so forth, but about a different kind of dynamic that we're going to be talking about, I think, in the coming chapters here. That's how I would say, for me, things changed over the course of my ministry and years, and that seemed to address this what people were feeling in the larger culture, that something was missing in their lives, and they found it in the life of the church in a way they couldn't find it anywhere else.
Mm.
And I think that seems to be the kind of demand, if I can put it that way, that we feel. And I think that strikes me as legitimate, don't you think? And it fits with
Yeah.
what pastors should be feeling.
Yeah, and I guess maybe a way to kind of round this out, and like you said, we'll continue to tease this out as we go into the next chapters. But there is a response to those numbers, which says that look at the market has spoken, and as a pastor, you need to somehow find a way to get more market share, which then just forms people to have a kind of imagination that says I should be happy with my church. In other words, I should get out of it what I want. I should never be
Yeah.
bored. It should speak exactly to the ideological positions I already hold. It should support those, and you can see how that will just lead to further burnout. That will just
Mhm.
lead to more problems because you're never going to be able to make everyone happy. But if you take this shift and think of it about imagination, then then you're asking people not to come and consume something, but to come and participate in
Right.
something, to
Right.
come and search for something here, to come in at least for this hour, at least for
And
this hour
and
to be
kind
reminded
well,
to look in and search for something.
and the word that shows up in your work quite a bit is encounter.
Yeah.
That it's right to expect you will encounter something here, and it's not going to be predictable. It's not always going to happen, but it is a common thread, if you will, in the life of the congregation.
Yep. All right. Well, that takes us to about 20 minutes, David. Thanks everyone for listening to this discussion. Any final words, David, before we move on to chapters 2 and 3 next? Right.
Yeah, just to say that this is just the beginning, and again, if you're reading along in the book, I think it will there'll be a connection happening, and we'll continue to follow the trajectory of the book. And one of the things that we take up in the next session here is what are the practices most essential to being a church that can help perhaps reshape the imagination of parishioners in the midst of this time.
Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.